Welcome to Kensington Palace, a place of secret stories and public lives. 300 years ago, it was the glittering heart of court life during the early Georgian era. It's always such a thrill to be in Kensington Palace, to walk in the footsteps of the Georgian kings and queens. But this time, I'm not here to talk about those monarchs and their grand advisors. This time, I want to go beyond these beautiful staterooms and try and find out what was happening behind the scenes. I've come to visit at a great time. Historic royal palaces have been working to lift the veil of the public-facing court and explore the lives of the many people who lived and worked here, in front of and behind the scenes. They've brought together an amazing collection of objects, many of which have never been seen before.
The apron is a genuine survival of something a servant wore, and we have very few such items.
It's a rare opportunity to explore what life was like for the servants and courtiers who ran Britain's royal palaces for centuries.
This kind of notebook is incredibly important because it gives us insight into what really went on every day.
From seamstresses to cooks, from wet nurses to yeomen, diplomats to royal attendants, a host of people filled Kensington Palace, keeping the royal machinery running. It's time to hear their story. In 1714, there was a seismic change in the British monarchy. The small, provincial and crucially Protestant court of Hanover crossed the Channel to London. George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, was crowned King George I, selected ahead of around 50 others who had stronger claims but were Roman Catholic. He adopted Kensington Palace as one of his principal residences and renovated it extensively. Unfairly, we often remember the Georgians by their lazy stereotypes. George I, who didn't really want to learn English, the German king who preferred being back in his native Hanover. George II, fascinated by military matters, by uniforms, the last king to lead a British army in battle. George III, the so-called farmer king, a man who wrestled throughout his life with bouts of insanity. And George IV, the interior design obsessed playboy who managed to convince himself that he'd been at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, as so often with stereotypes, there is an element of truth to them, but actually they obscure what's a far more sophisticated picture. 4 Georges ruling over 116 years, a time of profound societal, industrial, imperial transformation. And, ironically, a German family that helped to define Britishness itself. To get a sense of the people who thronged the Georgian palace, I'm starting at the fabulous King's Grand Staircase, an enormous mural depicting real characters who knew Kensington as a home and a workplace. All visitors to the royal court would enter by this route, so I'm following in their footsteps. It's called the King's Grand Staircase for a reason. It's almost still intimidating now, nearly 300 years after it was built, and I haven't got to meet the king at the top. This would have been illuminated by candlelight. You'd have been wearing your finest clothes. You'd been practicing your greatest lines to impress the monarch. Making all this pomp and circumstance happen, though, was an army of people. People who are captured on the palace walls. As you move up through this staircase, you're surrounded on all sides by beautiful art. Art that's imposing and impressive and conveys power, but also something very different. Lots and lots of human faces, and not as you might expect, soldiers or admirals or classical heroes of antiquity, but normal people. To find out more about these intriguing characters who still gaze at us from across the centuries, I'm meeting Kensington Palace curator Mishka Sinha.
So this staircase was painted by William Kent between 1725 and 1727, and he was commissioned by George I to paint the court. This kind of painting would normally have gods and goddesses or muses, and instead it's got people, actual people who are at the court.
Why was that? Is that something to do with George's character?
Perhaps George wanted to represent a different kind of court. It's much more cosmopolitan, it's much more diverse, because he's coming here in his 40s. He brings a large number of his courtiers from Hanover with him. They are very much resented by the English court. He has to send most of them back. But the ones he has, he kind of retains, and they become his intimate inner circle. We know that George is conscious of his own difference. We know that he's uncomfortable with the English court. So it's almost confrontational.
So people are climbing up these stairs, they're arriving, they're nervous, and they've got all these paintings going, you're coming onto our turf now. And the painting doesn't just represent the posher courtiers. Take a closer look and you could discover all of Georgian palace life.
What's interesting here is that there's a range of people. We think that that is a page of Henrietta Howard, who later became George II's mistress. She was woman of the bedchamber, which is quite a high up position held by aristocrats. On the left there is John Arbuthnot, who was a doctor and who had the care of the young boy there, Peter. Peter was another of the unusual elements of George's court that he chose to have portrayed. And Peter was known at the time as the wild boy. He was discovered in the woods near Hanover, and he was seen as something of a curiosity. Arbuthnot was given charge of the boy to try and teach him how to speak, which he never did learn.
What about the Highlander here?
We don't know who the Highlander is, but we wonder whether he's a political symbol to show that there are Highlanders who are still in favour of the king despite the Jacobite factions that continue to cause trouble for George. We also have this young boy who's climbing over the railing. It's difficult to know whether he was a real person at the court, but he could be an idealised figure, sadly, to represent wealth and status and the power of the king over the globe. This kind of representation of imperial and colonial power.
So there's so many possible interpretations here. It's political, it's reflecting his power or his cosmopolitanism. It's busy, isn't it?
It's incredibly busy.
And gazing down on this teeming world of courtiers and servants is the man who created it, the artist, William Kent.
The four figures that are closest to us, that's William Kent, and next to him is his mistress, and with them are Alexander Pope, the poet, and John Gay of the Beggar's Opera also. And then on the opposite side, you have musicians, and one of whom is a trumpeter whom we think might have been a man called John Cato. So we know that there is a tradition of black trumpeters at the English court from Henry VIII, but also at other European courts. And we know that John Cato was operating in London around this period.
Against a background of great change in the form of colonial expansion, religious wars, and a fledgling constitutional monarchy, new figures were arriving at Kensington Palace from all over the world, including black and Asian royal servants. Among them were Turkish valets, Ernst August Mustafa von Misitri and Mehmet von Königstruh, who was the master of the robes and the keeper of the royal purse for King George I. It's amazing to be here behind the scenes. This portrait of Mehmet is added to the Untold Lives exhibition.
He was one of two men that we know of who were taken prisoner of war in what was then Ottoman-governed Peloponnesian Greece. He was brought to Hanover, then joined the king's household in Hanover. When he arrived, he converted to Christianity, and he also married a woman from Hanover. We would now call her a German. When he was baptized, he took the name of George I, Ludwig Maximilian, but he retained his name Mehmet. And so he had this really interesting, I think, double identity, which you can see in a sort of in the way that he constructs himself as someone who is obviously exotic, but is not obviously from the Ottoman Empire. He's got this Polish Eastern European fur hat, and then he's got what look like Far Eastern undergarment and a jacket. So it's a very interesting composite identity that he creates for himself, and very unique.
And it is quite unique. A king of Britain, his two closest servants were from the East, and that was a little bit unpopular in some quarters.
Yes, they were quite unpopular. I mean, Mehmet has to make personal sacrifices to come to Britain, so does Mustafa, because they both have wives and children, and Mehmet has to leave his wife, Marie, behind, and it's clearly quite difficult for them to be separated. The other sacrifice he makes is that in Hanover, Mehmet has a social position. He's married to the daughter of a prominent brewer. He is ennobled in 1716 by the Holy Roman Emperor at George's request. Whereas in England, he's treated with suspicion. He's seen as an infidel. So he loses that status when he comes. There are sort of suspicions or slanders about their particular relationship with the king. I mean, they were his most intimate body servants. They performed tasks for him that were physically intimate. So Mehmet, for example, one of his tasks was to examine the king's piles. And that was quite physically intimate. He was also very privy to the king's private modes, which weren't always accessible to the rest of the palace.
But it's a bit suspicious. You've got a foreign king with these two foreign servants of Islamic origin. The Tory press wouldn't have been very happy with that.
Well, they're antagonistic towards George, they're antagonistic towards his German servants. The English court in general don't really like his German servants, they regard them with suspicion. And Mehmet and Mustafa, these two men who come from the Ottoman Empire, are even more suspicious because in a sense they're kind of at a further remove. They're not just foreign in that they're German, they're foreign that they're German and then from the Ottoman Empire. And even though they both convert to Christianity, they are seen as infidels.
The early Georgian period was a time when politics was still personal. The mood of the king, or his favour, could determine your fate. Kensington's rooms were full of servants of all classes, from aristocrats with high-ranking jobs to more lowly workers doing everything from carrying messages to cleaning the finery. It needs to be a smooth operation, both in front of and behind the scenes. Beneath this glamour and luxury, it's a very different side to this building as well, which you can see if you come through here. Suddenly, you're in a very different scene, a world of narrow corridors and staircases, a place that would have been inhabited by up to 1,000 servants, moving to and fro, doing a multitude of different jobs, all of them keeping this royal show on the road. The stairwells and corridors of this palace must have been so busy, so noisy, as hundreds of servants ran around from dawn till dusk doing their day's work. And the way that the great engine of this palace was kept running smoothly, all those servants, all those departments, was through the use of bells. A royal costume needs urgent attention, royal food needs to be served, messages need to be carried. The bells told servants where to be and when to be there. Bells defined the servants' work in this palace. Fittingly, a humble bell is taking centre stage in the exhibition.
This is a very typical servant's bell. And they've been up high on a wall somewhere, pulled by a wire. Obviously when the wire tugs, it will ring like that. They have different sizes to make a different ring, and so that would help the servants register where it's coming from, and they could look up on the board, it would be marked the name of the room they have to attend to. The idea was that the king and the queen would not see their servants unless they wanted them to attend them. Before these mechanised bells were wired up around the palaces so the servants could be invisibly summoned, they would have a little table bell with a handle and just ring it, and the servants, the footmen, would be standing outside the door, hear the bell and come in and attend to them without having to say a word. So there was a whole etiquette to how people were summoned by the bell. And of course there were the other bells with the bells on the clock towers, so they would know the hours of the day as the day ticked off, and they know what duties they had to go to at particular times of day. Bells really did rule their lives. So these simple little things like this really do sort of capture the very regulated lives of servants.
The royal staff list was unending. It contained a decipherant, a secretary for translating into Latin, an embellisher of letters to foreign princes, and 48 chaplains who were the master of the revels, the surveyor of the waterworks, the keeper of the lions in the tower. There were musicians and a dwarf comedian from Poland named Ulrich Jory, a clerk of the spicery, yeoman of the salt stores, 3 confectionaries who made the king's cakes. There was a master of the horses, there was a mole taker, a rat catcher, and a keeper of the ice and snow.
Some of the tools of their trade are going on show for the first time.
So this is a really unusual object for a very peculiar sounding job. This is an ice saw that would have been used by the keeper of ice and snow at the palaces, whose job was to collect ice from the canals and the ponds around the palaces and to save it as long as they could in the ice house, which is a big insulated sort of tank. And the royals were the first to have an ice house in this country in the 17th century, and one still survives at Hampton Court. And this is where the saw comes from. And it was there specifically for the fashion for having ice desserts and ice drinks, and also for cooling champagne, of course, which is another fashion of the time. And there was actually a keeper of champagne in the royal household at this time. Generally, these jobs were held by men. That was how the court worked. But occasionally, we'll find a woman has taken over one of these roles. This particular role in George III's reign, in about 1775, a lady called Frances Talbot took over the role. And it's quite a prestigious role in a way, well paid, over £100 a year, which is quite a substantial salary for the time. And she probably inherited the job through either a husband or a brother, and obviously successful with the job and kept it. And this happens with a number of quite unusual roles, such as the rat killers as well. We have a woman in that role.
The below-stairs area of a royal palace was a rowdy, hectic place. There was a labyrinth of departments, and a rigid hierarchy kept the many royal staff in order and linked them with each other.
There's a wonderful account written by the 18th century courtier Lord Chesterfield, who talks about how these palaces worked. And he says that if you want to understand how power flowed through these buildings, you need to pay attention, not just the politicians and the grandees, but the servants as well. He wrote, "There is at all courts a chain which connects the prince or the minister with the page of the back stairs or the chambermaid. The king's wife or mistress has an influence over him. A lover has an influence over her. The chambermaid or the valet de chambre has an influence over both," and so on ad infinitum.
Lord Chesterfield also commented that dress is a very foolish thing, and yet at the same time, it's a very foolish thing for a man not to be well dressed. Pleasure and politics were closely linked as everyone tried to catch the royal eye. One of the key jobs at Kensington was to make sure that everyone at least appeared to be enjoying themselves.
Animating the court was the job of an energetic band of smart, beautiful young women. They were known as maids of honour, and they had to be well born and very well brought up. And their role was to bring music and laughter and dancing and light into rooms exactly like this one. There would have been dances in here, and they'd have worn a very particular uniform. This extraordinary garment here. It is called a mantua, and it gets its bizarre shape from a frame made of whalebone. Now, these were very difficult to operate in. They couldn't really cross their arms. They certainly couldn't sit down. They had to take very small steps to walk anywhere. So it was as if the court was filled with beautiful women floating around as if they were on wheels. It was certainly a relentless, often uncomfortable role, but these women stood to make very advantageous marriages from their place here at the heart of court.
But all this finery required a whole pit crew of servants. I'm taking a close-up look at one particularly famous dress.
This dress was made for Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George III. It would have been an incredibly expensive dress. The laces would be made in several pieces. You can probably see the pieces, and then they were all stitched together. You can also see that it's been very finely crafted and has C's embroidered on it all over for Charlotte.
But for every finely dressed person like this, for every outfit like this, there's an army of people just keeping it in this condition. And there's many of these women walking around court.
It represents so much labour. I think it represents the seamstresses, the dressers, and then the laundry women who would have maintained clothes like this, who had tremendous amounts of work to do, washing and boiling and drying the clothes. And laundry women were actually quite high up in the royal household, were relatively well paid. They had a salary, but they also had an allowance for the things they needed, sort of a clothes chest to keep the clothes in, the alum and starch and other things that they would use to maintain the clothes. So they were relatively well paid, high status, but all the women working under them who'd have done the actual work would not have been so well paid and were probably casual labour that came in and out. We have to thank these people who maintained the clothes for this survival, the fact that we still have this.
Contrasting Queen Charlotte's extravagantly detailed dress, the exhibition also showcases the humble uniform of a woman who played a role in dressing her in finery. And the way servants dressed, in uniform or not, also indicated their status.
Compared to all the extraordinary outfits I've seen in Kensington Palace over the years, this is definitely the most modest, but it's equally important.
It is really important because the apron is a genuine survival of something a servant wore, and we have very few such items. So this belonged to a woman called Mrs. Thielke. She was a dresser to Queen Charlotte, and we know a little bit about her because she's mentioned in Fanny Burney's diaries. Fanny Burney was mistress of the robes, which was a kind of relatively high up position held by someone from a good family, and Mrs. Thielke would have been not quite there. Fanny Burney talks about what a pleasant woman Mrs. Thielke was and how much she appreciated Mrs. Thielke's presence, because she talks about how she would not have known in what order to give pieces of clothing to the Queen had it not been for Mrs. Thielke sort of handing them to her in order.
So we think of the 18th century very stratified, very formal, huge inequality. Actually, it sounds like there were relationships here at court between very grand people, even monarchs, and normal people who were their servants.
Yes, because these are the people who surround the Queen daily. So, Fanny Burney talks about how the Queen starts to put on her clothes at sort of 1:45. She talks about how she starts to powder her wig. And all of these things were done by people around her who would have been, in a sense, the people closest to her. Fanny Burney also talks about how the Queen would read her newspaper throughout the time while she was being dressed and read out bits to her. So there was a relationship there. And then she had a relationship with Mrs. Thielke.
Compared to exhibitions that you guys have done here around the queens or people like that, has this been much harder? You have to do lots more digging and sleuthing to find these objects?
For us, this was about doing an exhibition around the people who did the work, but they are often people who don't really have names and records, because the names and records are often of the wealthy and the privileged and the people who have status. And so trying to find records for underrepresented people is sort of like an anomaly, an oxymoron. How do you do that? And so digging around these stories has brought items to light, but there are things we're never going to know, but that leaves more to the imagination.
One very central part of life at court that's more well documented is the royal banquet.
Royal banquets were exceedingly elaborate. They were served in the French style, à la française, which means that all the food for a course would be laid out on the table at the same time. And that meant that when the butler came into the drawing room here and announced that dinner was served, people moved through to the dining room to see a massive table absolutely laden with delicious food. At Kensington Palace, some banquets had as many as 70 different dishes per course.
Sadly, the Georgian kitchens of Kensington Palace no longer survive, but they must have been a hive of activity to cater at such incredible volume, not to mention the quality expected by royal appetites. In charge of it all was one of the most important servants of them all, the royal master cook.
Normally have at this time 3 courses, but not like we think of today. Each course is laid out on a table on a sort of buffet for each course. A first course, and then actually an interim course called a remove, where they take away some of the dishes and bring some others, so they're removed, and then a second main course. The first one tends to have the really bigger, heavier dishes. The second one might be a bit lighter, perhaps a bit less red meat. And then everything's taken off the table and you have the dessert. And that's why we call it dessert today, because they take away everything and leave nothing, and leave the bare table without a cloth. And that's when they will bring on things to end the meal with.
Very luckily, we still have the surviving detailed records of one royal master cook.
William Daniel, the master cook, to George II and Queen Caroline. And this is his kitchen notebook, begun at Kensington Palace on June the 1st in 1736. As the master chef, he's in charge of all the deciding what specific dishes are served to the King and the Queen and the whole court, at the top end of the court, throughout the year. And it's an extraordinary record because it's his personal notebook and it shows his thoughts, his changes, his innovations sometimes, even doodles. And these records don't usually survive. So on the 11th of December, we started with some quite largely French influence and English things. So we have a potage puree of pork. We have pullets, small chickens in a ragout, that's a kind of stew, a white stew. But if we look down the page, we've got some interesting things which is showing influences from farther afield. So we've got literally macaroni and cheese, way back in 1736. And we also have a German dish here. I don't know what this is, we haven't really worked it out, but Früchtling Hanover. Of course, the King and the Queen born in Hanover. And they've taught this English chef how to cook it. Christmas Day, 300 years ago, and we have some familiar favourites, literally old favourites. Plum broth, mince pies, which would have had a lot of meat in them in those days. Our turkey, obviously. We have quite simple dishes like egg cheese and jellies. Those are meat jellies. So quite familiar fare there for Christmas Day. I think there's some really interesting food that's not typical of an English monarch this time. So there's quite a lot of offal. We've got here tongues and udders boiled. And that's quite, this is on the main royal plate. So that was considered something worthy of a king. And then, rather surprisingly perhaps, potted turtle. Well, yes, turtle was a great delicacy then, but next to it, puffins. This is happening at the top end of court. Obviously, they have the enormous reach of the court and the international trade, and the part of those things imported, as well as ideas about food, as well as some of the actual products. Up to this point, royal food was served usually on silver, occasionally gold, but to have a china plate was actually special. So certain dishes are marked down here as china plates, china hot, so hot food on china. They were probably quite smaller dishes and they've been quite elegantly arranged, and perhaps the centerpieces in the table looking different. And so the dishes in them are different from the typical dishes you find in the large, big salvers. This kind of notebook is incredibly important because it gives us insight into what really went on every day. So often in the past, the more ordinary people don't give us much a record of how they worked. And in the formal records that survive, you just don't get that sense of life, that sense of trying things out. Little marginal notes where somebody's obviously whispered in his ear and said, will you put that on the roll table today? And so it's a wonderful insight into how Daniel's worked and how the whole wider kitchen might have worked. And these kind of things are so exceptional. I think I've only ever seen one other of these.
As the kitchen sweated away below stairs, other courtly servants were ushering important guests into the royal presence.
Right at the top of the grand staircase is this intimidating presence room, and it is dominated by this royal canopy, and underneath it, the throne. That is where the king would have been sitting in splendour, receiving his subjects, listening to their requests and petitions. And this room is a really important reminder that the servants aren't just running around the palace, making sure that everyone's fed and watered and allowing the parties to take place, but they are creating these more formal situations, allowing the king to have an audience with his people.
By the Georgian era, Parliament had curtailed much of the independent power of the monarch, but the chance to vie for the king's attention at court was still highly prized, at home and abroad. Servants worked relentlessly behind the scenes to facilitate the smooth running of diplomatic visits.
One meeting took place in this room that I'm particularly fascinated by, and that is the encounter between a Cherokee chieftain called Tomochachi and George II in 1734. The British had just established the colony of Georgia in America, pretty much on Cherokee land. And now George II had a chance to talk with a Cherokee chieftain. We hear from accounts that the Cherokee's face was painted in black and red, and he presented George II with sticks with feathers on them, a symbol of peace.
It's extraordinary to think that this was the grand setting in which Tomochachi presented King George with eagle feathers that had been carried to several Muskogee towns, leaving them in the care of the king to signify their continued peace. This was a crucial early meeting between a British monarch and a delegation of Cherokee Indians from the new colony of Georgia, named for the king himself.
Kensington Palace wasn't just an important political centre of power. It wasn't just the royal court. It wasn't just a pleasure palace. It was also a family home. And that's why lots of the servants here were involved in the very important work of birthing and raising healthy children. Now that work is exceptionally important in a royal family, where successors and heirs are vital to maintain the dynasty. It was particularly important in the early 19th century. In 1818, George III had many grandchildren, but none of them were legitimate. So the race was on for any surviving sons to find an appropriate royal wife and have a legitimate heir that could one day sit on the British throne. And it was in this room in the spring of 1819 that project enjoyed great success, because just over there, a healthy little baby girl was born. She was named Victoria, and she'd go on to be the Queen Empress.
Taking care of and nourishing royal babies was a task of crucial importance, only entrusted to the most reliable servants.
This is Catherine Elliot, and she was wet nurse to James II. So, she'd have been wet nurse from sort of 1630s, and this portrait, I think, is from the 1670s or 80s. And so it's, she's around a long time.
And so this would have been customary for a royal lady, a grand lady, not to breastfeed their own children.
It was mainly aristocratic women and wealthy women who did it. It allowed them to sort of go ahead and do other things and perform other duties, and made sure the children were well looked after. But it also had things to do with fashion and garments, because then women wouldn't have to adjust their garments in order to be able to breastfeed.
Although she was no longer a wet nurse when this portrait was painted, Catherine Elliot's job had been to breastfeed the young Prince James, so his mother, Queen Mary, didn't have to.
Was she very obviously a really healthy specimen? Did they go and find someone who looked like they'd be brilliant at the job?
She was actually quite well connected, but most of them wouldn't have been. They would have been selected for their health, but they would also have to be quite discreet. That was quite important. And they had to live according to certain sort of standards of behaviour. Amongst other things that were imposed on them is that they weren't really allowed to keep in touch with their families or friends. But they did it because they were paid very, very well. So wet nurses were paid something like £500 in the first year. But then they would have continued to be paid for the rest of their lives, approximately £300 a year. So it's one of the reasons they left their families and were willing to do this quite difficult job was because of the amount that they were paid.
And interesting that she went from being a wet nurse to having a different role at court. Do we get a sense here of this sort of really a community around the sovereign?
To be sort of so intimate with the family, she would have been trusted and integrated into the family, and they were quite highly respected and held in high regard, as this portrait tells us, because to have a portrait of this size, this grandeur sort of painted, clearly she was well thought of. It was probably painted for James's daughters, who would have known her through their stepmother and mother. The portrait is noted in the 18th century hanging in the palace. So clearly it's a portrait that's given importance. It's not sort of covered in dust sheets and put away somewhere in an attic.
At the centre of royal life, from its social and political functions to its diplomatic and dynastic responsibilities, there were an army of servants who ran royal palaces for centuries. But looking more closely at everyday items from oil lanterns to bells and aprons, and examining less well-known finds like the tools of the keeper of the ice and snow, we can understand more about the lives of the people who worked here. Zooming in on the stitches in elaborate court dresses, and taking a look at the faces portrayed in art around the palace, opens our eyes to the huge range of backgrounds of these individuals, breathing life into real, often forgotten people who experienced the hierarchies and inequalities within places like Kensington Palace.
We can all recite the names of the kings and queens of Prime Minister that walked those corridors of power. But I'm embarrassed to say, until this trip to Kensington Palace, I hadn't really thought much about the other men and women who played a vital role in keeping the court going. People born high and low, who had different jobs to do. Some of them almost obscured from the historical record, but their stories are there and great researchers have found them. And it means that we can now build a much more real much more vivid picture of royal life in this palace.